You didn't just watch him drown in the mud, you stepped on his helmet to keep him down. Welcome to Brutal History for Sleep, where true stories tuck you in and betrayal makes the pillow softer. If this dark little bedtime tale helps you drift off, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Let me know where in the world you're listening from and what hour your worst decisions tend to arrive. Tonight, you send thousands of starving men into a battlefield bottleneck, wait for the screaming to stop, then pray like it was someone else's idea. You slit throats by torchlight, then thank God for victory. You call it Agincourt. Close your eyes. Seriously. Feel them getting heavier and heavier until they close gently. Feel the hush of my voice curling softly at the edges. The fire crackles, slow, deliberate. Your breath slows. The blanket rises and falls against you. The room is still, waiting. The silence feels patient, like mud pooling around your ankles. Now, smell wet leather and scorched meat. Hear the faint creak of armor. Above you, smoke drifts past snapped banners, and to your left, someone is whispering a prayer into a puddle. You're tired, hungry. Your king says you're about to be legends. But all you can feel is the cold weight of arrows in your quiver and the warmth of blood already soaking into the earth. Let's begin. Picture this, thousands of men marching through medieval France, and every single one of them is trying not to soil themselves. Not metaphorically, literally. Welcome to October 1415, where King Henry V's grand military campaign has devolved into the world's most prestigious case of collective food poisoning. The English army stumbled through the Norman countryside like a parade of the walking dead. Their boots squelched through October mud that seemed specifically designed to suck the hope from human souls. Rain had been falling for days, not the gentle patter that waters crops, but the vindictive downpour that turns roads into rivers and men into miserable, shivering creatures who question every life choice that led them to this moment. Henry V, blessed with the confidence of a man who'd never personally experienced dysentery, surveyed his troops with what he probably thought was inspiring determination. He'd just finished besieging Harfleur, a lovely little French town that had the audacity to resist being conquered. The siege had been a roaring success, if success meant losing half your army to disease, while the other half developed a deep, personal relationship with their bowels. "We march to Calais," Henry had declared, because nothing says brilliant military strategy like taking your disease-riddled army deeper into enemy territory. The French controlled most of the countryside. Winter approached like a promise of frozen death. And somewhere out there, the entire French nobility polished their armor and sharpened their swords, practically salivating at the thought of crushing this pathetic English expedition. The English force numbered perhaps 9,000 souls when they'd landed in France. Now, maybe 6,000 remained upright, and upright was being generous. These weren't the flower of English knighthood. Most of those had stayed home, citing important business like not dying of flux in a French ditch. No, Henry's army consisted primarily of archers, common men who'd been promised adventure and plunder, but had instead received diarrhea and despair. They trudged through villages already stripped bare by war. The French had implemented what military historians call a scorched earth policy, and what the English soldiers called, "those bastards took all the food." Every barn stood empty. Every well had been poisoned or filled with debris. The army survived on whatever they could scavenge, mouldy bread that crunched with suspicious texture, meat of dubious origin, and hope, though hope was running dangerously low. The archers wore whatever protection they could afford, which usually meant a helmet that didn't quite fit and a padded jacket that had seen better decades. They carried their longbows wrapped in waxed cloth, trying desperately to keep the strings dry. Wet bowstrings meant death in battle, and these men knew it. They'd spent their whole lives training with these weapons, pulling bows that required the strength of modern Olympic athletes. Their shoulders were massive, their backs curved from years of practice. They were specialists in the art of launching sharp sticks very fast at people who annoyed their king. Meanwhile, the French army mobilized with the enthusiasm of cats who'd just spotted a mouse with 3 legs. Messengers galloped between noble houses, carrying variations of the same gleeful message. The English are trapped, they're sick, they're outnumbered, This'll be easier than that time we conquered, well, anything. The French nobility saw opportunity. Here was Henry V, the upstart king who claimed the French throne, wandering through their territory with a ragged band of common soldiers. This wasn't just a chance for military victory, it was an opportunity to capture a king, to end English pretensions to French soil, to win glory that would echo through generations. Knights who hadn't agreed on anything since the invention of wine suddenly found common cause. But for the English, things deteriorated by the hour. Men collapsed on the march, too weak to continue. The lucky ones were loaded onto carts already groaning with supplies. The unlucky ones were left by the roadside, with a prayer and a promise that someone would come back for them. Nobody came back. Henry maintained an aura of religious certainty that bordered on the delusional. He insisted on daily prayers, as if God might suddenly remember he had an English army to save. The king ate the same terrible rations as his men, a bit of political theatre that impressed the soldiers while doing nothing for their intestinal distress. He walked among them, spoke words of encouragement in his mix of English and terrible French, and generally acted like a man who hadn't noticed that his brilliant campaign had turned into a death march. The French herald arrived on October 20th, bringing news that surprised exactly nobody. The French army had assembled and blocked the English route to Calais. "Your Majesty," the herald announced with the kind of smugness that only comes from knowing you hold all the cards, "the nobility of France awaits. They request you choose the field of battle as is proper when one is about to be thoroughly defeated." Henry responded with royal dignity, which is to say he told the herald that the French could go perform anatomically unlikely acts upon themselves. Privately, even Henry must have felt the cold grip of reality. His army was outnumbered at least 3-1. His men were exhausted, sick, and running on fumes of patriotism and fear. The smart move would be to negotiate, to seek terms, to find some face-saving way out of this mess. But Henry V wasn't famous for smart moves. He was famous for stubbornness that would make a mule look flexible. "We march," he told his council, who exchanged the kind of looks that meant, "We're all going to die, aren't we?" As October bled into its final days, the English army approached the village of Agincourt. The name meant nothing to them then, just another French village with too many vowels and not enough food. They made camp in the rain, because of course it was raining. It had been raining for so long that men had forgotten what dry felt like. The French army waited just across the field, their campfires twinkling like stars. If stars were attached to people who wanted to kill you. The French nobles held feasts in their tents, toasting their inevitable victory. Why shouldn't they celebrate? They had the numbers, the equipment, the home advantage. All they had to do was ride down a bunch of sick farmers with sticks. That night, Henry toured his camp. He found men trying to keep their bowstrings dry, sharpening arrows with the mechanical persistence of those who knew tomorrow might be their last day. Some prayed. Some wrote letters they'd never send. Most just sat in the mud, wondering how they'd gone from their villages in England to this nightmare in France. "Tomorrow," Henry told them, "we make history." He was right, though not in the way anyone expected. History was about to be made, written in mud and blood, and the screams of nobles who'd forgotten that warfare wasn't actually a game. The stage was set for one of the most lopsided battles ever fought, where being the underdog would turn out to be a grotesque advantage. The rain kept falling. Men tried to sleep in wet clothes on wet ground, dreaming wet dreams of home. Tomorrow would bring battle, but tonight brought only the promise of horror dressed up as glory. And somewhere in the darkness between the two armies, death itself must have been rubbing its hands together, preparing for one of its finest performances. Welcome to Agincourt, where chivalry came to die and took several thousand Frenchmen with it. Dawn broke on October 25th, like a hangover after bad wine, grey, unwelcome, and full of regret. The rain had finally stopped, which would have been good news if it hadn't left behind a field that looked like God's own mud wrestling pit. The narrow strip of land between the woods of Agincourt and Tramcourt stretched before both armies, perhaps 1,000 yards of freshly ploughed earth that had been marinating in October rain for days. The French nobles woke in their pavilions, probably wondering why their servants hadn't brought better weather along with the breakfast wine. They dressed in their finest armour, full plate that cost more than entire villages, polished to mirror brightness, decorated with heraldic designs that proclaimed their ancient lineages. Each nobleman was a walking fortune, a metallic monument to wealth and privilege. They looked magnificent. They looked invincible. They looked like men who'd never considered what happens when you put 60 pounds of steel on a horse and ask it to charge through a bog. The French battle plan was elegantly simple, which should have been the first warning sign. The nobility would charge in the first wave, smashing through the English lines with the weight of their social superiority. The second wave would exploit the gaps. The third wave would mop up survivors and take prisoners for ransom. It was foolproof. Assuming the field was dry, the enemy stood still, and physics took a holiday. Across the mud, the English army arranged itself with the grim efficiency of men who knew they were probably going to die, but intended to make it expensive. Henry positioned his force in a single line, about 900 men at arms in the centre, with roughly 5,000 archers on the flanks. The archers hammered wooden stakes into the ground at an angle, creating a hedgehog of spikes, designed to discourage horses from getting too friendly. They checked their arrows, tested their strings, and tried not to think about the wall of French steel gathering across the field. The French army was enormous. Contemporary accounts vary wildly, but somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 men crowded the field. They were organised in 3 massive battles, each one larger than the entire English force. The narrow field that had looked so innocent on maps now revealed its true nature, a bowling alley where the French would be the pins and the English arrows would be the balls. The Constable of France, Charles d'Arbray, surveyed the field with what he probably thought was tactical genius. He'd positioned his forces perfectly to maximise their numerical advantage, if by maximise you meant compress into a space so tight that men couldn't swing their swords without hitting allies. The woods pressed in on both sides, funneling the French advance into a corridor maybe 900 yards wide. It was like trying to fit the entire population of a city through a single doorway. As morning wore on, both armies stood in their positions, waiting. The French expected Henry to attack. After all, he was the invader, the one who needed to reach Calais. But Henry, displaying the kind of tactical wisdom that comes from desperation, did absolutely nothing. He knew that every minute his men stood still, their bowstrings stayed dry. Every minute the French waited, their horses grew restless and the field grew no wider. The French nobles grew impatient. This wasn't how battles were supposed to go. There were supposed to be heroic charges, glorious single combats, opportunities for valour that would be sung about for generations. Standing around in the mud while commoners with bows watched was beneath their dignity. Arguments broke out in the French command. Young knights demanded action. Older heads counselled patience. The young knights, because this is how history works, won the argument. Finally, around 11 in the morning, Henry made his move. But instead of charging, he ordered his entire line to advance about 700 yards and then stop, bringing them within extreme longbow range of the French. The archers uprooted their stakes, trudged forward through the mud, and replanted them. It was provocation, pure and simple. "Come and get us," it said, "if you dare." The French took the bait like fish attacking a hook made of their own pride. The first French cavalry charge began with all the pageantry of a medieval tournament. Banners flew. Armour gleamed despite the grey sky. War cries echoed across the field as hundreds of mounted knights spurred their horses forward. It should have been glorious. It should have been the moment where noble cavalry proved their superiority over common infantry. It should have been many things. What it actually was a physics lesson in why heavy objects don't move well through thick mud. The horses hit the churned field and immediately slowed. Their hooves sank deep with each step, turning what should have been a thunderous charge into something more like an aggressive trot. The knights, weighed down by armour that hadn't seemed heavy in the pavilion, suddenly discovered that momentum was not their friend. And then the arrows began to fall. The English longbow was not a sophisticated weapon. It was a piece of yew wood, bent and strung, that required years of training to use effectively. But in the hands of men who'd been practicing since childhood, who'd developed spines curved from the effort and shoulders like cart horses, it was a machine of death. The archers loosed their first volley at about 250 yards. 5,000 arrows rose into the grey sky like a flock of steel-tipped birds. They reached the apex of their flight, paused for a moment as if considering their options, then plummeted toward the struggling French cavalry. The sound was unique. Thousands of broadhead arrows punching through air, a whisper that grew to a shriek, then impact. Arrows struck horses in the neck, chest and haunches. The animals screamed, a sound that men who heard it never forgot. Knights who'd thought their expensive armor made them invulnerable discovered that while plate might turn an arrow, their horses wore much less protection. Mounts collapsed, throwing riders into the mud. Others reared and bucked, maddened by pain. The neat lines of the charge dissolved into chaos. But the French kept coming, because what else could they do? Retreating would mean admitting defeat to commoners. So they pressed on, into the storm of arrows that fell like rain in hell. The English archers worked with mechanical efficiency. Draw, aim, loose. Draw, aim, loose. Each archer carried between 60 and 80 arrows, and they intended to use them all. The French cavalry that reached the English lines found another surprise. The wooden stakes the archers had planted weren't just decorative. Horses, even trained war horses, have a deep aversion to impaling themselves. The charging cavalry hit the stake line and balked, piling up like a traffic accident in steel. The archers, who'd spent the morning wondering if they'd live to see noon, suddenly found themselves with a target-rich environment. They dropped their bows and picked up hammers, axes, and various sharp implements that medieval soldiers used when things got personal. What happened next wasn't combat, it was butchery. French knights, trapped in expensive armor that had become steel coffins, flailed in the mud. The armor that protected them from swords did nothing against an archer with a hammer and a working knowledge of where the helmet's weak points were. The sounds of battle changed from the clash of steel to the wet thud of metal on metal, punctuated by screams muffled by visors. Meanwhile, the French infantry in the second line watched their nobility being systematically murdered by peasants. They had two options: advance into the meat grinder, or stand there and watch. French military tradition, never one to choose the sensible option when honor was involved, demanded they advance. So they did, marching forward into the same narrow killing field where their cavalry was dying. The mud, already churned by horses, had become a swamp. Men in full armor sank to their knees with each step. The field, which had started the day as agricultural land, was transforming into something from a nightmare. A brown sea of struggling metal figures, punctuated by the still forms of the dead and the writhing shapes of the dying. The English archers had run out of targets at comfortable range. Some retrieved arrows from the dead. Others simply watched as the French infantry struggled toward them through mud that seemed to actively hate movement. It was like watching men try to run through molasses while wearing refrigerators. The French reached the English lines exhausted. They'd walked perhaps 300 yards. But, in full armor, through thigh-deep mud, under constant arrow fire, it might as well have been 300 miles. They arrived at the English position already defeated by terrain and their own equipment. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a harvesting. The English men-at-arms, relatively fresh and fighting on firmer ground, met the exhausted French with the enthusiasm of workers who'd finally found job satisfaction. The cramped battlefield meant the French couldn't use their numbers. They pressed forward in a dense mass, pushed by the ranks behind them, unable to swing their weapons effectively. It was a stampede, where everyone was moving at the speed of death. Henry V, watching from his position in the centre, must have felt the unique mixture of terror and elation that comes from realizing your enemy has done something catastrophically stupid. The French had turned their numerical advantage into a liability. They'd compressed themselves into a space where skill mattered less than the ability to remain standing. And they kept coming. The third French battle line, seeing the disaster unfolding before them, faced a terrible choice: join the massacre or abandon their comrades. Some charged forward, adding their weight to the press of bodies. Others, displaying the kind of wisdom that comes from watching your friends die horribly, decided that discretion was the better part of not being murdered by commoners. The battle had become a self-sustaining disaster. French nobles in the rear pushed forward, compressing those in front into an ever tighter mass. Men fell and couldn't rise, weighed down by armor and the press of bodies. The English, outnumbered but not outmaneuvered, worked the edges of the French mass like wolves culling a herd. And still the arrows fell. The archers, having retrieved what they could, continued their deadly work. At close range, a longbow arrow could punch through all but the finest armour. French knights who'd paid fortunes for their protection discovered that craftsmanship had limits, and those limits were being enthusiastically explored by men who'd learned archery before they learned to read. The cream of French nobility was being systematically destroyed by men they wouldn't have allowed to clean their stables. The irony was so thick you could have cut it with a sword, assuming you could find room to swing one. This wasn't how medieval warfare was supposed to work. There were rules, traditions, an entire social order built on the assumption that nobles were inherently superior to commoners in battle. Agincourt was busy proving that assumption wrong in the most violent way possible. The slaughter tunnel had opened for business, and business was horrifyingly good. By noon, the battlefield at Agincourt had transformed into something that would haunt the dreams of survivors for decades. The narrow strip of land between the woods had become a writhing carpet of steel and flesh, where the distinction between the living and the dead had become largely academic. The mud was no longer brown. It had taken on the darker hue of blood mixed with earth, creating a substance that medieval writers would struggle to describe without invoking hell itself. The French dead piled up like cordwood. Not metaphorically, literally stacked atop each other in mounds that grew higher as more bodies were added to the heap. The compressed battle line meant that when men fell, they fell on top of their comrades. When those comrades fell, they added another layer. The English archers, practical men who understood the value of good cover, used these piles of corpses as barricades. Nothing quite says medieval warfare like using dead nobles as impromptu fortifications. In the centre of this nightmare, something even worse was happening. French knights who'd fallen weren't necessarily dead, they were just trapped. Imagine wearing 60 pounds of steel armour designed to protect you from swords and arrows. Now imagine falling face first into mud while wearing that armour. Now imagine several of your closest friends falling on top of you. Now stop imagining it, because what actually happened was worse. Men drowned in mud. Let that sink in. Knights who'd survived arrows, avoided English weapons and maintained their footing through the charge, died because they couldn't lift their heads out of the muck. The weight of their protection became their executioner. They thrashed like overturned beetles, hands clawing at the mud, trying to find purchase, trying to push themselves up. But more bodies fell on them, pressing them deeper. The sounds they made, muffled by mud and metal, weren't quite screams. They were something worse. The English men-at-arms worked through the fallen with horrifying efficiency. They'd developed a technique. Flip the fallen knight if possible, find the weak points in the armour, armpits, groin, neck joint, visor slits, and apply sharp metal until movement stopped. It was specialised work, like being a medieval mechanic if mechanics murdered the cars. Some French nobles tried to surrender. They shouted their names, their titles, their ransom value. "I am worth 10,000 crowns" became a common battlefield cry, which was certainly different from the usual "for God and France." The rules of chivalry were clear. Nobles taken prisoner were to be ransomed back to their families. It was a civilized system that allowed warfare to be profitable without being excessively fatal to the upper classes. But the English archers weren't feeling particularly chivalrous. These were men who'd marched through hell, spent weeks dying of disease, and watched French nobles prepare to slaughter them. When a French knight raised his visor to shout his surrender, he often received an arrow to the face for his trouble. Ransom was a luxury for victors who weren't outnumbered 5-1. The battle had developed its own horrible rhythm. French reinforcements would push forward, compressing the mass of humanity even tighter. The pressure would build until men at the front were crushed against English weapons. Bodies would fall, creating new obstacles. The cycle would repeat. It was less like combat and more like a very violent industrial process. Some French nobles realized what was happening and tried to organize retreats. But retreat required space to turn around, and space was the one thing the battlefield absolutely didn't have. Men who tried to withdraw found themselves pressed forward by their own reinforcements. The battlefield had become a one-way valve that only led to death.
The Duke of Alençon, one of the highest-ranking French nobles present, managed to fight his way close to King Henry himself. For a moment, it looked like the battle might have its heroic single combat after all. The Duke, probably thinking this was his chance to end the battle with honour, shouted his challenge. He was immediately surrounded by English knights and beaten to death with hammers. Chivalry wasn't just dead. It was being repeatedly hit with blunt objects to make sure. As the slaughter continued, a grotesque economy developed on the battlefield. The English archers stripped the dead and dying of anything valuable. Jeweled daggers, gold spurs, and rings were prized from corpses. Some entrepreneurs among the archers started a side business. They'd partially strip a wounded French noble, then offer to finish him off quickly for whatever valuables remained. Medieval warfare had always been brutal, but this was capitalism with a mace. The French third battle line finally began to dissolve. These were the smart ones, or at least the ones who valued living over honour. They looked at the charnel house before them, did some quick calculations about glory versus survival, and decided that they had urgent business elsewhere. Anywhere else. Some fled on foot, struggling through the same mud that had doomed their comrades. Others, the lucky few who still had horses, galloped away. The English, exhausted from hours of slaughter, let them go. There's only so much killing a man can do before his arms get tired. But the horror wasn't over. The battlefield was covered with wounded French nobles, men worth fortunes in ransom. The English began gathering prisoners, herding them into groups. Finally, it seemed, the rules of civilized warfare would apply. Nobles would be ransomed, money would change hands, everyone would go home with stories of their martial prowess. Then, Henry received reports that the French baggage train was under attack. Whether this was true or merely panic hardly mattered. Henry looked at his exhausted army, looked at the hundreds of French prisoners who outnumbered their guards, and made a decision that would stain his reputation for centuries. Kill them all. The order rippled through the English ranks with the kind of shocked silence that follows truly appalling commands. Kill the prisoners? Kill nobles who'd surrendered? Kill men worth more than most English soldiers would see in a lifetime? But Henry was insistent. He couldn't guard them and fight simultaneously. Dead prisoners couldn't revolt. And so began one of the most controversial massacres in medieval history. The English men-at-arms, products of a culture that valued honour and chivalry, largely refused to participate. Killing in battle was one thing. Murdering prisoners was another. They'd crossed many lines that day, but this was a line too far. The archers had no such qualms. These were practical men who'd spent the day discovering that French nobles died just like anyone else when you hit them hard enough. They set about the business of execution with the same workmanlike efficiency they'd shown all day. The French prisoners, realizing what was happening, reacted in various ways. Some begged, offering vast ransoms, lands, titles, anything. Others prayed, trying to make peace with a god who seemed to have taken the day off. A few fought back with their bare hands, which went about as well as expected. Most simply stood there, unable to process that they were about to be murdered by commoners after surrender. The killing was methodical. Archers worked in teams, one to hold, one to strike. They used whatever was handy, axes, hammers, daggers. Some prisoners were herded into buildings, and the buildings set on fire. The screams from inside provided a soundtrack to an already hellish scene. It took perhaps an hour to murder hundreds of France's nobility. An hour to transform what might have been a profitable victory into an atrocity. An hour that would be debated by historians for centuries, with some calling it military necessity and others calling it what it was, mass murder. When it was over, the English stood among thousands of corpses. The flower of French chivalry lay dead in the mud, killed not in glorious combat, but in a systematic slaughter that resembled nothing so much as a particularly violent day at an abattoir. The battlefield fell quiet, except for the moans of the wounded and the cawing of crows who'd discovered that today's menu was extensive. Henry walked among the dead, probably trying to convince himself that God had ordained this victory. It's easier to sleep at night when you believe divine providence guided your hand, rather than admitting you just orchestrated one of the most lopsided massacres in European history. The English began the grim business of counting the dead. On their side, perhaps 100 men had fallen. The French losses defied belief.
Thousands upon thousands of corpses carpeted the field. The mud was no longer visible beneath the bodies. Some were so pressed together that they remained standing, held upright by the compression of corpses. The Constable of France was dead. The Admiral of France was dead. 3 dukes, 8 counts, a dozen barons. The casualty list read like a who's who of French nobility. Entire family lines had been extinguished in a single morning. The battle was over, but the screaming continued. Wounded men cried out from beneath piles of bodies. Some would be rescued by comrades or ransomed by entrepreneurs. Most would die slowly, crushed or suffocated or simply forgotten in the maze of corpses. The crows grew bolder, beginning their feast even as men still breathed beneath them. Agincourt had proven many things. That courage meant nothing against geography. That noble birth provided no protection against arrows. That chivalry was a luxury only the winning side could afford. But mostly, it had proven that warfare wasn't glorious. It was logistics with a body count. The sun began to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across a field that would never grow crops the same way again. Too much blood had soaked into the earth. Too many men had died in too small a space. The very soil had been transformed by the concentrated horror of the day. And still, unbelievably, it wasn't over. There were still survivors to hunt, wounded to finish, and a victory to secure. The English might have won the battle, but they still had to survive the aftermath. And in medieval warfare, sometimes the aftermath was worse than the fighting. King Henry V stood in the middle of his impossible victory, covered in mud and other people's blood, probably wondering if this was what divine favour was supposed to feel like. Around him, the English army moved through the field like exhausted scavengers, poking at piles of corpses with the weary efficiency of men who'd discovered that winning could be just as horrible as losing. The king had started the day with speeches about God and glory in England. He'd quoted scripture, invoked saints, and generally acted like a man who believed his own propaganda. Now, surrounded by thousands of French corpses and the moans of the dying, even Henry's legendary confidence must have wavered. This wasn't how the songs would describe it. The immediate problem was practical. What to do with victory when you're still outnumbered, exhausted, and very far from home? The English had won the battle, but they were still a small, sick army in the middle of hostile territory. Somewhere out there, more French forces might be gathering. The paranoia that comes from being surrounded by enemies doesn't disappear just because you've killed a few thousand of them. Henry ordered his men to strip the French dead. This wasn't cruelty, it was economics. Every piece of armour, every weapon, every jewelled dagger represented wealth that could fund the army's survival. The archers set about their work with the enthusiasm of men who'd just discovered the world's most morbid shopping mall. The looting revealed the true scale of the French disaster. Noble after noble was identified by their coat of arms, each discovery adding another great name to the list of the dead. The Duke of Brabant had arrived late to the battle, so eager to join the glory that he'd borrowed armour from his chamberlain and charged in without his servants. They found him dead in mismatched armour, killed by men who hadn't even known they were murdering royalty. Some French nobles were still alive, wounded but breathing. These presented Henry with a dilemma. Traditional chivalry demanded they be taken prisoner and ransomed. But Henry's army was small, exhausted, and still had to march to Calais. Guarding prisoners would require men he couldn't spare. Feeding them would mean sharing supplies that were already running low. Then came the reports, possibly real, possibly paranoid fantasy, that the French were regrouping for another attack. Henry made his infamous decision: kill the prisoners. All of them, no exceptions. The order shocked even hardened soldiers. These weren't enemy combatants anymore. They were captives, many of them wounded, all of them worth fortunes in ransom. The English men-at-arms, still clinging to some shred of chivalric ideals, largely refused. They'd signed up to kill Frenchmen in battle, not murder them in cold blood. The archers, as we've established, had fewer scruples and more practical attitudes toward throat-cutting. What followed was medieval efficiency at its worst. The prisoners were gathered in groups. Some were herded into barns, and the barns set ablaze. Medieval warfare's answer to industrial processing. Others were simply put to the sword, assembly line style.
The Duke of Orléans, one of the few high-ranking nobles to survive, was spared only because he was cousin to the king and worth more alive than anyone else. He watched as men he'd known his entire life were butchered like cattle. One group of prisoners tried to make a break for it, running in full armor toward the woods. They made it perhaps 50 yards before the archers brought them down. Running in plate armor after a day of battle was optimistic at best. Running from men who could put arrows through that armor at distance was just sad. The massacre took time. Killing hundreds of men, even cooperative ones, isn't quick work. The English developed a system. Prisoners were brought forward in batches, made to kneel, and dispatched with whatever was handy. Hammers, axes, and daggers all served their purpose. Some archers, either through dark humor or practical economy, started charging the condemned for quicker deaths. 2 coins for the neck, 1 for the belly, became a battlefield merchant's cry. Medieval capitalism had found its darkest expression. The French priests among the prisoners begged for time to give last rites. Some were granted this mercy. Others received abbreviated services, a quick blessing shouted over the sound of killing. God's representatives on earth discovered that diplomatic immunity didn't extend to battlefields where panic outweighed piety. As the killing continued, Henry toured the battlefield, perhaps trying to convince himself this was necessary. He stopped at the pile of bodies where the Duke of York, one of the few English nobles to die, had fallen. The Duke had suffocated in his armour, an ignominious death for a man of his station. Henry ordered the body prepared for transport back to England. Even in death, social class mattered. The slaughter of prisoners finally ended when it became clear no French counterattack was coming. The panic had been false, or at least premature. Hundreds of French nobles had died for nothing more than Henry's anxiety. The king ordered the killing stopped, though by then there were few left to save. As evening approached, the English faced the monumental task of dealing with the dead. Thousands of corpses lay in piles across the field. The October weather was cool, but not cool enough to prevent what would come next. Bodies bloat. They smelled. They attract creatures that spread disease. The English, still planning to march to Calais, couldn't afford an outbreak of plague. The solution was practical and horrifying. Strip the valuable corpses and leave the rest for the locals to deal with. The English took what they could carry: armor, weapons, jewels, anything that could be sold or ransomed. The rest was abandoned. Wagons were loaded with loot until they groaned. Men who'd started the day wondering if they'd survive were now arguing over who got the gold-inlaid sword or the jeweled dagger. Victory has a way of changing perspectives. But not everything could be carried. The armor alone from thousands of dead nobles would have required a wagon train stretching for miles. Choices had to be made. Premium pieces were kept. Standard armor was abandoned. Weapons were evaluated for their resale value. It was like the world's grimmest garage sale. As darkness fell, the English made camp near the battlefield. Nobody slept well. The field was too close, the smell too strong, the memories too fresh. Men who'd spent the day killing had nightmares about the faces of those they'd killed. Others dreamed of drowning in mud, weighed down by invisible armor. Some didn't sleep at all, just stared into the darkness and tried not to think. Henry held a service of thanksgiving. He praised God for delivering victory against impossible odds. He spoke of divine providence, of England's righteousness, of how the French had been punished for their pride. The men listened with the hollow eyes of those who'd seen Providence up close and found it looked a lot like butchery. Priests moved through the camp, offering blessings and absolution. Many soldiers sought confession, suddenly concerned about the state of their souls. Killing in battle was one thing. The church had rules for that, penances that could cleanse a warrior's conscience. But what penance existed for systematic massacre? What prayers could wash away the blood of prisoners? The night dragged on. Sentries were posted, though it was unclear what they were watching for. The French army had been essentially destroyed. Any survivors were probably running as fast as their traumatized legs could carry them. But paranoia doesn't listen to logic, and these were paranoid times. Somewhere in the darkness, wolves howled. They'd smelled the battlefield, nature's clean-up crew, announcing their intentions. By morning, they'd be among the corpses, adding their own horrific touch to an already nightmarish scene. Other creatures would follow, Crows, rats, dogs, anything that understood the equation of death plus time equals dinner. The English woke before dawn and prepared to march. They were eager to leave this place, to put distance between themselves and what they'd done. But first, there was one last task. The wounded English needed to be loaded onto carts. The handful of French prisoners who'd survived the massacre needed to be secured, and Henry needed to make a final tour of his victory. The king walked among the piles of dead as the sun rose. The bodies had stiffened overnight, frozen in their final positions. Some still clutched weapons. Others reached toward the sky with mailed fists, as if trying to grasp something that had eluded them. The mud had hardened around them, creating a grotesque sculpture garden of medieval mortality. Henry probably said something kingly and appropriate. He was good at that, finding the right words to transform horror into heroism. But his words couldn't change what had happened here. Thousands of France's finest were dead. The prisoner massacre had added a dark stain to what might have been remembered as a glorious victory, and the English still had to get to Calais. As the army formed up to march, they took one last look at the field. The locals were already emerging from the woods, coming to identify their dead and begin the impossible task of cleanup. They moved carefully, aware that the English were still armed and still dangerous. Nobody wanted to join the corpse piles by seeming threatening. The English marched away from Agincourt, leaving behind a field of horror that would take weeks to clear and years to forget. They carried their loot, their wounded, and their memories. They left behind thousands of dead, a devastated French nobility, and questions about the nature of warfare that would echo through centuries. Henry V had won his great victory. He'd proven that English arms could triumph against impossible odds. He'd also proven that victory could be every bit as horrific as defeat, and that sometimes the difference between a hero and a monster was simply a matter of who was left to write the history. The road to Calais stretched ahead, and every man in the English army was eager to travel it. Anything to get away from Agincourt, where the line between glory and atrocity had been drawn in mud and blood and the screams of dying men. Behind them, the crows descended in clouds, beginning their feast. The clean-up of Henry's great victory had begun. The English army limped away from Agincourt like thieves fleeing the scene of a crime. If the crime scene was the size of several football fields, and the evidence included thousands of aristocratic corpses. Every man carried something taken from the dead, a piece of armour here, a jewelled dagger there, enough noble accessories to stock a very morbid museum. The army had transformed overnight from a desperate band of survivors into what looked like the world's most traumatized travelling merchants. Wagons groaned under the weight of looted armour. Soldiers who'd barely been able to stand the day before now staggered under loads of French steel. One archer had strapped 3 helmets to his pack, giving him the appearance of a man being followed by very short, headless knights. Another wore 5 sword belts, jangling like a martial wind chime with every step. Victory, it turned out, was heavy. The march to Calais took on a surreal quality. Here was an army that had just achieved the impossible, shuffling through the French countryside like a hangover with legs. They passed through villages where the inhabitants hid behind shuttered windows, probably wondering if these were conquerors or just very well-armed burglars. The distinction had become somewhat academic. Henry tried to maintain some pretense of order. He issued proclamations about not looting churches, respecting civilians, and generally behaving like proper English soldiers, rather than grave robbers with a royal charter. The men nodded respectfully and continued stuffing their packs with anything that wasn't nailed down, and some things that were. One enterprising group of archers had acquired a small cart and turned it into a mobile armour shop. They'd sorted their loot by quality and size, creating what was essentially a medieval boutique, specialising in gently used, previous owner deceased, fashion. Business was brisk among soldiers who'd missed out on the better pickings. "This breastplate's got a hole in it," one customer complained. "That's where the arrow went in," the archer merchant explained. "Gives it character. Shows it's battle-tested. Battle failed, more like. Take a moment with only minor crushing damage." Deal. The French prisoners who'd survived the massacre marched in the middle of the column, closely guarded and profoundly confused about still being alive. The Duke of Orléans,
the highest-ranking survivor, maintained his dignity despite circumstances that included being surrounded by men wearing his dead friend's armor. He'd later write poetry about his captivity, though he tactfully left out the part where he'd watched his entire social class get murdered by peasants. As they marched, the reality of what they'd achieved began to sink in. They'd faced the cream of French chivalry and turned it into fertilizer. David hadn't just beaten Goliath. David had beaten Goliath and his extended family, then stolen their jewelry. The stories began almost immediately, growing with each telling. "I personally killed 7 knights," one archer claimed, forgetting that yesterday he'd been crying about his feet. 7? "I killed 7 just getting to my position," another countered. "Killed one with my bare hands, I did." "Your bare hands were holding a hammer at the time." Still counts. The wounded presented their own challenges. Medieval medical care consisted primarily of hoping things got better, with occasional assistance from prayers and questionable poultices. Men with arrow wounds were considered lucky, at least arrows could be removed, usually. Those with crushing injuries from maces or hammers faced grimmer prospects. The medical tent was a chorus of groans and the sound of saws. One soldier had taken a mace to the helmet and survived, though his skull now featured an interesting new shape. He claimed he could hear colours and see sounds, which his companions found either miraculous or brain damage, depending on their level of medical understanding. Another had lost 3 fingers to a French sword, but considered himself fortunate. "Could have been me head," he philosophized, waving his abbreviated hand. "Now I can only count to 7, but I'm alive to count." The army's priests worked overtime, offering blessings, last rites, and explanations for why God had allowed such slaughter. The theological gymnastics required to justify the prisoner massacre would have impressed scholars. Most soldiers preferred simpler comfort. They'd won, they were alive, and they had French loot. God's plan could sort itself out. As they neared Calais, the condition of the army deteriorated further. The adrenaline of victory had worn off, replaced by exhaustion, untreated wounds, and the recurring dysentery that had never really left. Men who'd fought like lions now struggled to walk like humans. The loot that had seemed so valuable now felt like anchors. Some soldiers began abandoning their heavier prizes, creating a trail of discarded French armor like very expensive breadcrumbs. Others stubbornly held on to everything, determined to profit from their survival, even if it killed them. One archer died 2 days from Calais, still clutching a jeweled sword worth more than his village. His companions buried him with it, either out of respect or because they couldn't pry his fingers loose. The English finally sighted Calais on October 29th, 4 days after the battle. The city walls must have looked like paradise to men who'd spent weeks expecting death. Here was safety, English territory, and most importantly, ships to take them home. The garrison at Calais turned out to welcome their king and his impossible victory. They'd heard rumours. French refugees had been streaming past for days, telling tales of apocalyptic slaughter and English demons who killed nobles like chickens. Seeing the actual army, battered and disease-ridden but victorious, must have been surreal. Henry ordered a service of thanksgiving in Calais Cathedral. The entire army packed in, filling the space with the smell of unwashed victory. The king spoke of God's grace, English courage, and the righteousness of their cause. The men listened, swaying slightly from exhaustion, probably thinking more about food and ships than divine providence. The counting of the dead continued in Calais. English losses were confirmed at around 100 men, though this didn't count those who'd died on the march or would die from their wounds. French losses were harder to calculate, partly because there were so many and partly because nobody wanted to seem like they were bragging. Conservative estimates put it at 6,000. Less conservative estimates used words like apocalyptic and everybody. Lists of the French dead read like a social register of medieval France. The Constable of France, dead. The Admiral of France, dead. The Master of Crossbowmen, dead, ironic considering how few crossbows had actually been used. 3 dukes, 8 counts, a couple of archbishops who'd decided to play soldier, and enough barons to staff several kingdoms, all dead. The impact on French nobility was generational. Entire family lines had ended in the mud of Agincourt. Widows across France would wear black for years. Children would grow up with portraits of fathers they'd never see again. The complex web of medieval marriages and alliances had been torn apart in a single morning. Meanwhile, back at Agincourt, the locals faced a clean-up job that would have challenged modern disaster response teams. Thousands of corpses lay rotting in the October sun. The Bishop of Arras organised the burial efforts, probably wondering what he'd done to deserve this particular blessing. Mass graves were dug. The noble dead were supposed to be identified and buried separately, but after days in the elements, identification became increasingly theoretical. Many nobles ended up in common pits with their social inferiors, achieving in death the equality they'd avoided in life. The armour and weapons the English hadn't taken were collected by locals and sold to merchants who specialised in the second-hand death market. Agincourt armour would circulate through Europe for decades, each piece carrying its own dark history. Some buyers swore they could still hear the screams of previous owners. This was probably rust, but medieval people enjoyed their ghost stories. The battlefield itself remained scarred for years. Crops planted there grew strange, fed by the blood of thousands. Local farmers reported unusually large vegetables and correspondingly disturbing dreams. Animals avoided certain areas where the dead had been thickest. Even the rain seemed reluctant to wash away what had happened. Back in Calais, the English prepared to sail home. Ships were loaded with men, loot, and stories that would grow in the telling. The Channel crossing was rough. October seas had their own opinion about comfortable travel. Men who'd survived Agincourt found themselves vomiting over the rail, offering the fish a preview of English cuisine. Henry sailed separately, as kings do, probably already composing the speech he'd give to Parliament. He'd need to explain why his glorious campaign had consisted mainly of disease, one apocalyptic battle, and a massacre that even medieval standards found questionable. But he'd also returned victorious against impossible odds, and victory has a way of editing history. The common soldiers cared less about political spin and more about survival pay. They'd been promised wages and bonuses for the campaign. Some would actually receive them, eventually, after much bureaucratic wrangling. Others would spend years trying to collect, waiving IOUs from a king who was better at making promises than keeping them. But they had their loot. Armour, weapons, jewels, and stories worth their weight in gold. Every tavern in England would soon hear about Agincourt, each telling more dramatic than the last. The mud would get muddier, the French more numerous, the victory more impossible. Veterans would show their scars and their stolen French daggers, proof that they'd been there when history pivoted on the edge of a longbow arrow. The French, meanwhile, began the long process of explaining how the finest military aristocracy in Europe had been slaughtered by commoners. Blame was distributed liberally. The constable should have waited, the field was too narrow, the mud was treacherous, the English had fought without proper regard for the rules. Nobody wanted to admit the simple truth that their entire military system had just been proven obsolete by men with sticks and string. Chronicles would be written, each trying to make sense of the senseless. French writers would emphasize the heroism of their fallen, the tragedy of the defeat, the various ways it wasn't really their fault. English writers would craft propaganda, portraying Henry as God's own warrior king, glossing over the messier bits like the prisoner massacre and the fact that most of his army had been shitting themselves, literally, for weeks. But for the men who'd been there, who'd stood in that narrow field and watched the impossible happen, no chronicle could capture the reality. The sound of arrows hitting armour, the sight of nobles drowning in mud, the smell of death on an industrial scale, the weight of stolen armour on exhausted shoulders. These were their souvenirs from hell, and they'd carry them forever. The ships carrying the English army home wallowed through the channel like pregnant whales, overloaded with men, loot, and the kind of trauma that would invent new categories of nightmare. Below decks, soldiers who'd survived the impossible discovered that victory had a cruel sense of humour. They'd lived through Agincourt only to face death by seasickness while clutching stolen French helmets like the world's least comforting teddy bears. The crossing was a special kind of hell. October storms turned the channel into a washing machine set to traumatize. Men who'd stood firm against charging knights found themselves reduced to moaning wrecks, praying to any god who might stop the world from spinning. The ship's holds, crammed with looted armour,
created a symphony of metal-on-metal crashes with each wave. It sounded like the French cavalry was charging again, except underwater and very, very angry. One archer, still wearing a looted French breastplate he refused to remove, had to be physically restrained from jumping overboard. "The armor wants to go home," he screamed, convinced the steel was cursed and trying to drag him back to France. His mates tied him to a mast and took turns vomiting near but not quite on him. It was what passed for friendship after what they'd been through. The wounded fared even worse. Ship surgeons, a generous term for men who owned sores and weren't squeamish, did what they could. Mostly this involved cutting things off and hoping for the best. The screams from the surgery mixed with the screams from seasickness, creating a chorus that would have made hell's demons jealous. One soldier, delirious from fever and blood loss, kept reliving the battle. "The mud," he'd shriek. "They're drowning in the mud." His comrades would hold him down, whispering reassurances that sounded hollow even to themselves. How do you comfort someone who's seen nobles suffocate in their own armour? You don't. You just hold them and pretend tomorrow will be better. But not everyone was making it to tomorrow. Bodies slipped overboard in the night, committed to the channel with whatever prayers exhausted men could muster. Some died from wounds that had seemed survivable on land. Others simply gave up, their bodies deciding that enough was enough. Each splash was another name that wouldn't make it into the victory songs. When the white cliffs of Dover finally appeared through the mist, grown men wept. Not the dignified tears of homecoming heroes, but the ugly sobbing of people who genuinely believed they'd never see England again. They stumbled onto the docks like drunkards, kissing the ground and immediately regretting it, because Dover's docks weren't exactly clean. But it was English dirt, and after French mud it tasted like home. The news of Agincourt had preceded them. Messengers on faster ships had carried word of the impossible victory, though the details were still murky. The crowds that gathered expected to see conquering heroes. What they got were scarecrows in stolen armour, men who looked like they'd fought death itself to a draw and weren't sure who'd won. "Is that them?" a woman whispered, watching the soldiers shuffle past. "Can't be. They look half dead. Maybe that's what victory looks like. Then I'll take defeat, thanks." King Henry, of course, had sailed separately and landed looking appropriately regal. He'd had time to wash, change, and practice his God-granted-us victory face. He rode through the streets of London in triumph, probably not mentioning that most of his army was still trying to remember how to walk on surfaces that didn't move. The parade was everything a medieval victory celebration should be. Banners flew. Crowds cheered. Captured French nobles were displayed like exotic animals, trying to maintain dignity while being gawked at by people who'd never seen a duke up close. The Duke of Orléans waved politely, already calculating how many years of captivity his ransom would take to negotiate. He'd spent 25 years in England, writing poetry and probably wondering what had gone so catastrophically wrong. But away from the parades, in taverns and homes across England, the real story of Agincourt was being told. Veterans gathered in groups, sharing the kind of stories you couldn't tell in polite company. They'd start with the heroic bits, the charge, the arrows, the impossible odds overcome. But after enough ale, the darker truths would emerge. Remember when William drowned in his own helmet? Couldn't forget if I tried. You still hear him screaming through the metal. He didn't screaming. Couldn't scream. That was just the air bubbling out. Christ. Yeah. The wounded who'd made it home faced their own battles. Medieval England wasn't equipped for soldiers with what would later be called shell shock. Men who jumped at sudden noises, who saw French knights in every shadow, who woke screaming about mud and arrows. They were curiosities at best, embarrassments at worst. Some found work. Others begged. Many drank, trying to drown memories that had learned to swim. One veteran, missing his left arm from a French sword, set himself up as a storyteller in London's markets. He'd act out the battle using wooden figures, complete with mud made from Thames River sledge. His most popular demonstration involved showing how French knights drowned in their armour. Children loved it. Their parents, watching his eyes as he described the drowning, paid him to stop. The loot from Agincourt created its own problems. Soldiers trying to sell French armour discovered that the market was flooded. Literally everyone had French armour to sell. Pried plummeted.
Breastplates that had cost more than estates were being traded for meals. One enterprising archer opened what he called Agincourt authentic armaments, selling certified battlefield loot. The certification consisted of him swearing it was real, which was good enough for tourists. The French prisoners who'd survived began their long captivities. Noble families mortgaged entire provinces to ransom their relatives. Some prisoners spent so long in England they forgot how to speak French properly. The Duke of Orleans became something of a celebrity, writing melancholy poetry that English ladies found terribly romantic. He'd survived history's worst military disaster for his class. Of course he was depressed. Back in France, the scale of the disaster was still sinking in. Entire regions found themselves without noble leadership because their leadership was fertilizing a field near Agincourt. Widows wore black until black became less a sign of mourning and more a fashion statement born of necessity. Children grew up in castles that felt more like tombs, surrounded by portraits of fathers who died in mud. The French court tried to maintain normalcy, but how do you govern when half your governing class is dead? Positions that had been hereditary for centuries suddenly had no heirs. Administrative systems collapsed. Tax collection, always unpopular, became nearly impossible when the collectors were corpses. The power vacuum created opportunities for those lucky enough to have avoided Agincourt. Distant cousins became direct heirs. Minor nobles found themselves elevated to positions they'd never dreamed of, usually because everyone ahead of them in line was dead. It was social mobility through mass mortality. The church held memorial services that went on for months. Every cathedral in France echoed with prayers for the dead. Priests ran out of different ways to say taken too soon, and started recycling eulogies. The sheer number of noble dead meant that some families had to schedule their mourning. Tuesday for Uncle Charles, Thursday for Cousin Henri, weekends for the various brothers-in-law who'd had the misfortune of being brave. The battlefield itself became a pilgrimage site, though not a popular one. The locals had cleared the bodies, but the earth remained stained. Pilgrims reported strange sounds at night, moaning winds that sounded like dying men, metal clanking that couldn't be explained. Probably just the weather and imagination, but Agincourt had earned its ghosts honestly. Crops planted on the battlefield grew strangely. Wheat came up thick but wrong, the grain a darker colour than it should be. Vegetables grew to unusual sizes, but tasted of iron. Local farmers learned to plant elsewhere, leaving the battlefield to whatever wanted to grow there naturally. Mostly, that was grass that even animals avoided. Henry V, basking in his victory, began planning new campaigns. Agincourt had proven that the French could be beaten, that English arms could triumph against any odds. He conveniently forgot that most of his army had been dying of dysentery, and that victory had come through geographic luck and French stupidity, rather than English superiority. But that's the thing about winning. It rewrites history to make victory seem inevitable. The veterans knew better. They'd been there. They'd seen the impossible happen, but they'd also seen the cost. In taverns across England, they'd raise their cups to fallen comrades and try not to think about French nobles drowning in mud. They'd show their scars and tell their stories, each version a little different, all of them true in their own way. Some veterans never spoke of it at all. They came home, hung up their boughs, and pretended Agincourt had been a bad dream. But on rainy October nights, when the mud in English fields grew thick, they'd remember. The sound of arrows, the screams of horses, the sight of nobility dying in ditches, and they'd pour another drink, hoping to sleep without dreams. Years passed. Henry V would die young, his dreams of conquering France dying with him. The 100 Years' War would drag on, a bloody stalemate that made Agincourt look like a decisive moment, when it had really just been one more atrocity in a century of them. The veterans grew old, their numbers dwindling. The stories evolved, becoming legend. The mud deepened in every telling. The French numbers grew. The English victory became more impossible, more glorious, more divorced from the reality of diseased men slaughtering trapped nobles. But on quiet nights, in the last moments before sleep, the survivors remembered the truth. Agincourt hadn't been glorious. It had been necessity mixed with geography, desperation combined with French tactical stupidity. It had been survival at any cost, including costs that would haunt men until they joined their victims in whatever afterlife awaited warriors who'd broken all the rules. The chroniclers wrote their histories, turning butchery into poetry. Kings claimed divine favor. Priests preached about God's judgment on French pride. But for those who'd stood in that narrow field, who'd drawn their bows and swung their hammers and watched chivalry drown in mud, Agincourt would always be something simpler and more terrible. It had been the day the world changed. The day common men proved that nobility meant nothing against geography and sharp sticks. The day medieval warfare revealed itself as organised murder with better publicity. The day they'd all become killers and discovered that victory tasted like blood and mud and the tears of French widows. The fires burned low. The stories wound down. Old men prepared for sleep, hoping tonight would be different, knowing it wouldn't be. Somewhere in their dreams, it was always raining at Agincourt. The French were always charging. The mud was always hungry. And they were always covered in other men's blood, standing in a field of corpses, wondering if this was what winning was supposed to feel like. Sleep well. Try not to dream of Arrow Estuary Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Research Opus 4. Thank you for listening one last time. May your sleep be deep, your dreams quiet, and your mind at peace. Good night.